What is going on, you guys? Today I am back with part 3 of my recap for the amazing series 3 Body. As we start off our recap and delve into episode 11, it begins with showing us the very young Ye, who finishes copying those letters for Bai, who wanted to send it to the party as he wanted to warn the administration about ecological disaster. As Ye was running away from whatever it was that happened to her life, she still wasn't comfortable being around anyone, and this shows with the very high tension and awkwardness that Ye displays inside of Bai's hut before she left. She even offers to wash his coat for him to cut the tension, but he tells her that he's observed that the women in the camp work as hard as the men, and that he didn't want to bother her any further aside from copying those letters for him. He watches her leave his hut, and in the days to come, we observe Ye in action at the camp, assimilating with the collective and performing hard labor. The reporter Bai leaves as he's now observed their camp, but it didn't make any difference to Ye's life as she continued to work diligently and kept a low profile until one day she was called into the camp's office. The person who called her over told her that she might be in trouble, and Ye, feeling quite anxious, got inside the car and went to the office to see what was what. Waiting for her there was somebody called Zhang from the political office. Their group leader introduces her to him and tells her that he's here to do a survey and to answer all of his questions honestly. But this man was not there for a survey, as he starts taking out a letter from his bag and reveals it to Ye to be the very same letter that she copied for Bai, as his hands were worn out from cutting the trees all day. The letter was the very same one that she copied, but at the end there was something that changed the entire meaning of the letter, as it was signed by the revolutionary masses, who were a group of people who were anti-Mao's revolutionary government at the time. Zhang asks Ye if she's the one that wrote the letter, and she says no, but he tells her he cross-checked it with her handwriting and it checks out, and then she changes her tune and says yes, she is the one that wrote it, but she merely copied it for another individual. When asked who this individual might be, Ye freezes as she didn't want to reveal it to be the reporter Bai Mulin. But after she gets pressured hard enough, she comes out and says it. Then to her surprise, Zhang tells her that they've run a thorough investigation on comrade Bai Mulin, but after their investigation, they've only found out that Bai only helped her mail the letter and that she was the one that wrote every word. The plot thickens as she asks if he was the one that said this about her, and Zhang screams for him to come out, and reporter Bai reveals himself from the back. Zhang then goes on to say that she was inspired to write the letter by reading the book Silent Spring, which was published in the Western world in 1962. If you guys remember from the last episode, this was the very same book that the reporter Bai gave to Ye to read in secret. Zhang was very proud to say that the book stirred capitalist society and that it's used as a bad example for their communist society to show just how selfish and corrupt capitalists are. He claims that she stole the book from the lowly reporter, read it, and wrote the very defamatory letter about the Chinese Communist government. But Ye responds with the truth, saying that she never stole the book and that Bai lent it to her for her to read. But as soon as she says this, Bai loses his mind and throws the book at Ye and continues huffing and puffing, pretending not to know anything and attempting to paint her as the villain that stole the book and wrote the letter to stir up controversy and stop Mao's revolution. As punishment, Zhang says to interrogate her until she admits to her guilt and to take her to the division. Next we see a person called Representative Chang going to see Ye in her very cold holding cell. This official Chang tries to be nice to Ye, but Ye was already suspicious as she thought that something wasn't right about all this. And her suspicions were true, as Chang wanted her to sign papers that would incriminate her father, who was deemed to be a counter-revolutionary. Chang tries to strong-arm Ye into signing the letter, as it was already signed by her sister and 4 other people, but in the end, Ye ultimately refuses. In the present, we see Ye explaining this to Wang, and how she received heavy sentence for her unrelenting behavior, and how as an older person now, she understands why Bai betrayed her and did what he did, as the political environment at the time was incredibly harsh, and it was either he betray her or be forced to face the consequences that he was not ready for. As the episode wraps up, the elderly Ye explains how using pesticide for human beings may seem like the right option, but for nature, all that pesticide does is merely try to alter the natural process and destroy everything in its path. She talks about pesticide, as it was the main theme in the book Silent Spring, and just on the last scene, we see Ye has been transferred to another place from the division, even though she didn't cooperate with Chang. As episode 12 kicks off, we see Wang reporting his findings about Ye to Captain Shai. Captain Shai is feeling more confused about the information, as it doesn't technically reveal much, and he goes on to ask Wang where Ye was taken to after her release from the division. But she never told Wang where she went to, and he tells Captain Shai to find out for himself. Some of Ye's files from the past, as she was working for the Communist Party, were still classified. Shai talks to the general and asks him to declassify some of those files, but the general tells him that everything has to go through a process and reveals something that he himself personally knew. He tells Shai that Ye was part of some kind of military operation, and it all had something to do with information interference with the West. He describes to him this big satellite at the base where she worked in years ago, and it's because of this satellite and the work that she did in the past that some of her files are kept classified. But this wasn't enough information for Captain Shai, and he urges the general to keep digging, as Captain Shai now considers Ye to be the center point of the entire investigation. At their favorite restaurant, Wang and Shai discuss the contents of the game 3 body. Wang talks about how the game is all about figuring out patterns. All the characters that he's met so far were trying to use their real-life knowledge about physics to determine how the sun will behave. But none of the scientists so far were able to find out when the stable era will begin and the chaotic one will end. Captain Shai, not understanding the complexity of the game, tells Wang to figure it out soon, but Wang tells him that he's gonna need somebody to help him with this, so they both make their way to the observatory to talk to Shah. They tell him that they need his expertise and want him to play the game with them, but Shah was too excited about playing the game, especially when he found out that they're gonna give him a V-suit to play it. He requests for 40 V-suits, but Shai only decides to give him 5. When they were all about to enter the game, Wang's wife calls him and tells him to pick up their daughter from school and to have dinner with her. But Captain Shah tells Wang that he'll go take care of his daughter, so Wang can go inside the game to figure things out. When he logs into the game this time, the civilization has changed, and it was the Aztec period, and there was another scientist that claimed to have figured out how the sun moves. He explains to Wang that before he came along, there was an era where Confucius tried to dictate why the sun was moving the way that it was, but one day, the sun just rose in the middle of the sky and suddenly disappeared and they saw a shooting star, but immediately after, night fell and everything, including Confucius, froze to death. But now during his era, he's constructed a replica, not of the sun or the earth, but of the entire universe, and he claims to have understood where the chaotic era ends and the stable one begins. He managed to do this using his model, which is based on the universe being at the center of a sea of fire. He shows Wang the map that he drew. Wang then logs out of the game and tries to replicate the map in real life with Shu. The very resourceful Shu manages to replicate the model perfectly, but then Wang notices something that's unnatural. He realizes that the model that Mosey made, the scientist that made the universe model, was completely wrong because he forgot to include shooting stars into his algorithm. So Wang goes back inside the game to warn Mosey and to ask him about the shooting star factor, but Mosey tells him that the shooting star was just an anomaly. And to prove his point, he asks Wang to fast forward the time and to see if his predictions of how the sun will move are wrong. At first, it seemed as though Mosey did figure everything out, but when Wang investigated further using Mosey's telescope and kept fast forwarding the time, something unprecedented happened that neither Mosey nor Wang have foreseen. The sun seemed like it was rising, but it was actually approaching the Earth at an exponential speed, and everyone and everything, including the civilization, got wiped out. The game was over after another tremendous failure by another scientist, and Wang and the team then meet up at Shah's observatory to showcase to Shai what they learned about the game. They explain to him that the game is incredibly stable except for one factor, which is the sun. The point of the game is to predict the sun's movement, and even though nobody has managed to do that yet, Shah and Wang discovered a certain kind of pattern as they've noticed the sun in the game 3 body is somehow correlated with a shooting star. Whenever there's a shooting star observed in the sky, a stable or a chaotic era seem to appear before disappearing again as the sky reveals a bunch of other shooting stars. They note that there must be some kind of relation between the two events and decide to keep playing the game to investigate further. This is where episode 12 leaves us, and as we start episode 13, we see the team leaving the observatory, and Captain Shai noticed how Shah was able to make all these conclusions just playing the game once, and he asks Wang if Shah was able to do this because he was an astrophysicist, and Wang replies by saying yes. Then Shah tells him to go to Yi and talk to her as she's also an astrophysicist, and maybe she'll also have better insights into the game as well. Next we see Captain Shah going to his favorite reporter Mu Xing meeting and asking her about her recent scandalous reports and where she's obtaining all the information from. He tells her that her reportings are sinister as they make people skeptical of science and technology, but she says that she's trying to be objective as much as possible. When he asks her who's feeding her all this info, she tells him to investigate her and to arrest her if he finds any evidence of malpractice. She says this because she doesn't know anything about Mr. Pan, and she indirectly wants to use Captain Shai to find out who Mr. Pan is and where he's getting all this info from. And speaking of Mr. Pan, he somehow manages to kill off more scientists, one of them who actually won a Nobel Prize. The military urges Chang to take action, even though they don't have enough information as to who their enemy might be. And Shen confronts Pan about these murders, and here an interesting conversation happens where she tells him that he shouldn't be using the Lord's powers to do his own bidding, insinuating that he's somehow using an otherworldly power to kill off all these scientists. And here we understand that Shen and Pan are not friends at all, they're actually mortal enemies. He tells her that the Earth needs to be punished for its sins and that he wants Lord to come to their planet and do so. She tells him that the commander will not let him do this, but he responds by saying that all of this was the fault of their commander. The commander being the person who serves as a bridge between Lord and Shen and Mr. Pan. Our scene next shifts to Wang as he's invited Ye to his laboratory. They talk a little about astrophysics and he shows her the work that he does at the lab concerning nanotechnology, and as he was trying to probe and ask about the game, she gives him insight into moving stars and also a bunch of references to an esoteric book that nobody really knows about. She then goes on to say that she knows the author of one of the books and that he's irresponsible and callous and that some of the things that he wrote are intentionally unfactual. Wang then asks her to continue the story that she was telling him days ago. If she was left in that very cold room as punishment for the letter that she did not write, she says that she would have died, but someone picked her up in a helicopter and took her to a place called the Red Coast. The person that took her to the facility was called Yang, and Yi recalls how he was the only person that was nice to her back at the facility in the Red Coast. Before she entered the Red Coast facility, Yang gave her a choice of going back to the division and ending her sentence of 10 years, urging her not to get inside the Red Coast facility because if she does, she would spend the rest of her life there and never leave. But Yi didn't want to go back to the very cold room and decided to walk into the Red Coast, knowing that her life could potentially end there. In the present, Wang and Yi talk about how mysterious the Red Coast base was, and Wang was incredibly excited to find out what experiments it was that they were running and why it was kept as a big secret. The facility was like any other facility that Yi has seen at the time. It was incredibly massive and had hundreds and thousands of workers operating inside. Yang explains that it's a research facility, but the research they were doing was based on weapons, and if they managed to succeed, their weapon would be more powerful than a hydrogen bomb. Yang then gets called off to look at some data and to run a simulation test, and Yi for the very first time notices the weapon, that is the satellite, going online. As soon as it started to transmit, the ice around the facility begins to melt, and all the sparrows in the forest begin to fly strangely, then suddenly they collapse and die. At the time, it was a simulation test, but Yang and his team's calculation was wrong, and the satellite stops operating shortly after. As the days and weeks went by, Yi started to get better from her injuries and the cold that she endured back at the division, and she also grew fond of the facility, and she would sometimes walk out to the tip of the mountain to see where she used to be held before she got there. And this is where episode 13 concludes. As we kick off with episode 14, Yi recounts how at first she was given menial tasks like cleaning up machines. And since she was considered a counter-revolutionary, nobody at the facility really trusted Yi, and they had to assign a guard every time she performed tasks or did anything at all. Even the guard himself was curious as to what she did to get sent to the facility and why they had to assign him to her to observe her every movement. And one day, as she was doing maintenance, she finds that one of the logs displayed on the machine was wrong, and she reports this to one of the engineers. Yang shows up and asks whoever is responsible to fix it, and he commends Yi for her keen observation. Even though Yang is really nice to Yi and he tries to watch after her, he's still very skeptical of her, and he doesn't want her around any of the facility's equipment, as he still somehow considers her to be a risk. As they walk around the very busy facility, we learn that Yi first became interested in physics, as her mentor was one of the most educated people in all of China, and from then on, she took an interest in radio astronomy. Through years of training, she became really good at it, but so far, she still hasn't made any more discoveries or any achievements at all. Their conversation gets interrupted by Yang's boss Lei, who is astounded that Yi is also a physicist, and tells him to bring her on at the team, as he hates a man called Lu, who made the error that Yi noticed, and Lei believes that Yi would do a better job than he, and he urges Yang to put her
her in charge of the department instead of Lu. Even being considered for the position, Ye's heart felt a sense of joy. As the days went by, she served as a technician in coverage for this person Lu, and her guard would one day tell her as she was having lunch that this guy Lu was incredibly incompetent and almost never shows up to work, complaining that he's sick or having some other kind of excuse. He tells Ye, now that she's there to cover for him, he fears as though Lu would become even more incompetent. That day, at night, they run their experiments with the big satellite again, but the transmission still malfunctions, and Ye suspects that it's due to all the equipment which is really old. But the operators report that it was a manual glitch from one of the machines that was crossed off on Ye's checkup list that was supposed to be maintained by Lu himself. She goes to Yang's office to tell him that Lu has figured out the problem, but somebody else has crossed it off the list. But hearing this, Yang was not surprised. He shows her the original copy of the cross-check list and tells her that it was Lu himself that crossed it off, knowing that the machine was not operating well, as Lu is trying to do everything he can to prove himself to be incompetent because he wants to get transferred from the Red Coast community. Yang tells Ye that in actuality, Lu is one of the best scientists that they have at the facility, but after he got to the Red Coast, he saw just how life at the facility was cruel and pointless, but he realized this too late, cause once a person enters the Red Coast facility, there is no backing out. Yang talks about this and says to Ye that if they keep Lu at the facility, even though he may be a very smart scientist, he will probably end up sabotaging their experiments as he can't stand the living conditions of the Red Coast facility. And again, Lei interrupts their conversation and makes the same suggestion that he made weeks ago. He tells Yang to make Ye in charge of Lu's operation, as Lu has once again proven himself to be very incompetent and an overall hindrance to the entire experiment. But Yang's response remains the same. He doesn't want Ye to be responsible of anything, and he wants her to stay in maintenance. In private, Lei asks Yang why he had her pulled out from the division, and Yang responds by saying that he just wanted her to do maintenance work, but Lei thinks it's a waste of manpower as Ye has proved herself to be more than competent and is an incredible astrophysicist. But Yang kept responding by saying that she was unfit to enter the core of the Red Coast. He also noted how she's made a major mistake and how putting her in a position of such high power can compromise their entire experiment. But even though Yang and Lei had a difference of opinion, at some point, Ye finally took over Lu's position and proved herself to be more than competent. Yang was not happy with the decision and he did everything he could to stop it, but it happened anyways and Ye was very pleased. The coming weeks after, Lei and Ye grew closer. Whenever she applied to read books or made suggestions, Lei would be there starting a conversation and asking her why she did this or that, or what her professional opinion was as to how the facility was run. Most of Ye's concern with the facility was that they used really outdated machines, but Lei would remind her that their purpose was to work under the Communist Party and make what was impossible possible for their country by using the only things that they can get their hands on. In another instance, 5 weeks later, Lei would approach Ye again and asks her what she thinks about the department. She at first was very hesitant to point out any mistakes, but after Lei coerced her a bit and told her she could say anything she wanted to, she points out the various kinds of errors that she observed. One of the very last things that she points out was that the entire facility was technically a very giant radio transmitter and nothing more. But Lei corrects her by telling her that it's a microwave oven instead of a radio transmitter. He first explains how a microwave works to her, and back in that time, most of Chinese people didn't even know what a microwave was, nor understand its practical applications. But Lei explains it to Ye, and asks her if she knows what the purpose of this entire facility was, to which she replies by saying no. He draws on a board explaining how the satellite works inside the facility, and how they're gonna use it as a weapon to target enemy satellites to stop all of their communications. And this time Yang interrupts their conversation and confronts Lei about telling Ye all this information that was supposed to be confidential. But Lei explains that they need to make achievements, and in order to do so, everybody must be on board with what their purpose is and also have comprehension as to what the facility's function was. He also explains to Yang that Ye overshadows most of the employees inside the facility, but Yang was still not on board as he still deeply mistrusted Ye. She later confronts him about this, asking him why he brought her to the base if he didn't trust her at all. She never really quite knew why he mistrusted her, but it just remained that way for a while. And the next day after she confronted him, she was transferred out of the transmission department, even though Lei wanted her to stay there. As we come back to the present, Ye explains that Lei made a personal decision to get her transferred, and she also says something quite interesting to Wang and tells him that Lei actually lied to her that day when he explained that the satellite worked as a microwave oven. She tells Wang that it was all a lie and that the satellite was much more important and its function that that much more sinister. And when Wang asks her what it was, Ye tells him that she's already spoken too much, and their conversation ends there. Wang reports all this to Captain Shai later that night, and Shai was quite disappointed that Wang couldn't discover what the satellite was built for, but Wang tells him to discover it for himself as he is the policeman and not Wang. And the episode wraps up with Captain Shai giving Wang the report that Shaw from the observatory gave to him, and Wang discovers that the paper was actually written by Ye years ago, and some of the references that she's left there are the very same books that she told him to look up. As we then take a look at episode 15, it starts with Wang having some food with his family and going over that reference book that Yi gave him. And with a very interesting conversation with his daughter, Wang makes a breakthrough in the game 3 body and logs in to inform the others. When he logs in this time, he goes to the European Middle Ages and he explains the programs of Aristotle, Galileo, and Leonardo da Vinci he's finally figured out the pattern of the sun. So what he's figured out is that there's not actually one sun in the game of 3 body. There are actually 3. In a stable orbit where there is only one sun, there is a stable era where people prosper. But when one or more of the other suns moves within a certain distance, their gravitational pull will snatch the planet away from the sun that it's orbiting. This causes the planet to wander unstably through the gravitational fields of the 3 suns. And this is when the stable era ends and the chaotic era begins. But after an uncertain amount of time, the planet will once again be pulled into a temporary orbit and another stable era begins. As Wang was explaining all this to everyone, including the Pope, they didn't even let him finish before condemning him to death. This happened because nobody's ever observed 3 suns before, and everybody in the room thought that Wang was just pulling their leg. But he then goes on to explain that the sun that they all see at different times may not be the same one. It's probably, most definitely, only one of the 3 suns. And when one of the suns is visible, the other 2 suns are just flying stars. And flying stars are stars with unstable cycles of revolution and rotation. And when the suns are far enough, they actually look like flying stars. Galileo tries to tell Wang that he's wrong and that they've never seen 3 suns before, but Wang continues his explanation, saying that the planet inside the game 3 body has a specific type of atmosphere. He also says that the fact that nobody ever recorded 3 suns was because if all 3 suns rose at the same time, they would give off enough heat to turn everything into lava. And even if people managed to record something, their recordings, including the people, would turn to dust in a matter of seconds. And even though Wang tried to make his point as clearly as possible, they still tie him up to burn him alive. But before they do, another massive sun rises inside the game and melts everything down, including the very big cathedral that Wang was inside of. But this time when the game ended and the civilization collapsed, it's reported that Wang has finally figured out the game, and the game itself has now transitioned to level 2. After leaving the game, Wang explains everything to Captain Shai, and he also tells him how the answer was right in front of them. It's actually in the name of the game 3 body. 3 indicating the 3 suns inside the game. But Captain Shai's question to all this was how all of this relates to the farmer and shooter theory, and how any of this nonsense is gonna help him solve the case. Later, as Captain Shai goes out to dinner with Shu, they talk about how Yi's in the middle of everything, and how it was her paper and her references that enabled Wang to discover the contents of the game. Maybe she indeed is part of the frontiers of science, or related to it one way or another. This is the very same thing they tell General Cheng, as Captain Shai has also invited him for food as well. He takes away his food and asks him if he's declassified Yi's files, but Cheng tells him to wait, informing him that these kinds of things are gonna take time. Later at the Frontiers of Science, after another shooter and farmer demonstration, Shen is confronted by the very persistent reporter Mu Xing, who keeps questioning her about the Frontiers of Science and Shen's relation to Mr. Pan. But the only thing Shen tells her is that she has a difference of opinion with Mr. Pan, and that Mu Xing is always welcome at the Frontiers of Science, as they have nothing to hide, even from reporters. And later we see Wang spending some quality time with his family, and after which he decides to log into the 3-body game again. And this time, Wang greets programs of Isaac Newton and von Neumann. They then decide to do calculations based on Wang's idea, but in the game they didn't have any computing power whatsoever, as computers were not invented yet. But von Neumann had a really great idea. He claimed that he could compute every bit of data by just using random people. But in order to do so, he needs 30 million people to obey his commands. When Wang asks him how they're gonna get 30 million people, Von responds by saying that this is why he came to the East, because in this period, the first emperor of China ruled over millions and millions of people. So Isaac, Vaughn, and Wang make their way to the Emperor's castle. They tell him that they have a perfect model for the sun's patterns, and that they require 30 millions of his soldiers to perform their bidding in order to calculate the pattern itself. But the king was not convinced, and he asks Vaughn to demonstrate what he's talking about. Vaughn then asks for 3 of the soldiers, and gives them 2 balls of light, one indicating the value of 0 and the other 1. They would then move their hands in certain kinds of motion, and somebody would write down and calculate the values of each ball, making the computation apparent to any scientist that can read it. The Emperor then trains all of his soldiers in such a short amount of time, then Vaughn, Isaac, and Wang then begin to put their idea to fruition. The pattern of the soldiers' movements act as logic gates, and these logic gates and their results would be recorded by all the educated scholars inside the Empire, and would later be translated and computed and presented to the scientists so they can make their conclusions. And as Wang was trying to make his way inside the game, Shu and Captain Shai were discovering more about the deaths of all the scientists. They discovered that Yi had a niece, but she actually didn't have anything to do with Yang Dong's death. But they also find that Shen has also hired so many mathematicians to a nanotech laboratory that she owned. This wasn't really surprising as scientists get hired all the time, but what was surprising was the number of scientists and why all of them needed to be mathematicians for Shen to want to hire them. All this time, Captain Shai, the general, Shu, even Wang himself thought that everything about the case revolved around physics, but now they're discovering that it also had something to do with mathematics as well. And they also realized that it had something to do with Yang Dong's husband, who was also interested in mathematics. And after making that discovery, they decide to pay him a visit, and meanwhile, inside the game, the king finally gives the order for the experiment to commence, and after a couple of glitches and some beheadings, they finally come up with the results, but our episode wraps up before they make any conclusions. Let's collect 1500 likes under this video, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to watch the rest of this series. So please, subscribe.